Well, good evening from the Indiana Council on World Affairs to our members and to the many guests participating in our program from around the U.S. For those of you who joined us early, I hope you enjoyed the selection of traditional Uyghur music, and I thank the Uyghur language department at Indiana University for making that available. I thought it was beautiful. We are recording this evening's program, and tomorrow we will post a link on our ICWA web page under recordings. So if you want to share it or watch it again, please feel free. My name's Larry Cimino, and I'm the volunteer president of the Indiana Council on World Affairs. And on behalf of our board of directors, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's distinguished speaker program on Uyghurs Today, What Happened to the Camps, featuring Indiana University professor Gardner Bovington. Before we proceed with this evening's program, I want to mention a few things about the Indiana Council on World Affairs and our programs. So in addition to our monthly distinguished speaker event, this winter we're again presenting Great Decisions series over 8 Tuesday, also via Zoom. Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on world affairs. We'll be sending you additional information about next Tuesday's program on changing demographics. So join us if you can, or contact us to learn how you can set up your own Great Decisions discussion group in your community. Also, let us know if you'd be interested in volunteering to help us continue our 68-year unbroken history of bringing programs like this to Indiana that help make sense of world events. After the initial discussion with our distinguished speaker, we'll open the floor to your questions, and we do encourage your participation in the Q&A by using the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Some of you already sent some questions to me, which we'll try to address if time permits. The Indiana Economic Development Corporation is our distinguished speaker season sponsor. The IEDC is committed to attracting and supporting new business investment, creating new jobs for Uyghurs, and furthering Indiana's reputation as a top state for business. I also want to thank all of our sponsors and donors to this program. Every single contribution helps us to deliver on our mission. So thank you very much for those who made a donation to us this evening. Much appreciated. As an educational, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization with an all-volunteer board, we pride ourselves in organizing and hosting timely events of international importance in a format that promotes respectful dialogue and exchange of ideas on a wide range of topics. As we do not present debates or point-counterpoint events with opposing sides facing off against each other, I feel it's only fair to say about this evening's topic that the official position of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, is that they categorically deny a genocide of Uyghurs or any organized campaign of violence against them. When asked about the plight of the Uyghurs, Chinese Consul General Zhao Jian in Chicago, who addressed our board of directors last week in a special session, stated that a rise in radicalization and violence in the region and an independence movement among Uyghurs led to greater investment in the region to create economic opportunities, which required additional education and vocational training for the population, and that China welcomes people to visit the region themselves to observe this. Now, I'm not suggesting that authoritarian leaders are above making statements that are contrary to the verifiable evidence. As I mentioned earlier, we strive to help make sense of events that confronted with us with alternative facts. So take Mr. Putin's statements about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for example, or even situations closer to home. But since the CCP was not invited to participate in this discussion, I felt it appropriate to put this out there. And I know that our speaker this evening is prepared to address this. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's program, and he will in turn introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Gardner Bovington. Dr. Ian McIntosh is an anthropologist and the director of international partnerships at IUPUI and an associate with the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. He's also the former associate director of the Confucius Institute in Indianapolis, which promoted ties of friendship and cooperation with China. His documentary, Waves of Fortune on the Maritime Silk Road, is available on Indiana Public Media, and his most recent book, Pilgrimage, Walking to Peace, Walking for Change, is available on Amazon and is a must-read for anyone contemplating a peaceful walk to reaffirm membership in a global community facing global challenges. Dr. McIntosh is also a member of our ICWA Board of Directors. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks so much, Larry. Dr. Gardner Bovington researches nationalism, identity politics, and ethnic conflict in China and Central Asia. His first book, The Uyghurs, Strangers in Their Own Land, focused on the tumultuous history of Uyghurs and Xinjiang since the founding of the People's Republic of China. He is now writing a book on architecture, city planning, and identity in Kazakhstan, with a focus on the Soviet and post-Soviet periods. Dr. Bovington earned his BA in politics from Princeton University and his PhD in political science and government from Cornell University. And he now serves as an associate professor at Indiana University in Bovingdon. Dr. Bovington, welcome. There has been a good deal in the press in the past 3 to 4 years on the plight of the Uyghur Muslims and other Muslim minorities in Western China, with some commentators, as Larry said, using the term genocide to describe what is happening. We've all seen the images of the enormous camps in which upwards of 10% of the Uyghurs are held against their will. Of late, the world's attention has turned to other conflicts, and thus the title of your presentation, What Happened to the Camps? In order to explore the reality behind those impenetrable walls, we will first establish the context through a series of questions that I'll put to you. Then, as Larry says, we can open up the session to a general Q&A. So let's begin. Dr. Bovington, who are the Uyghurs and where is Xinjiang?
Thank you for the gracious introduction, and thank you for this opportunity to speak. This is a very important topic, and I will admit, as I warned you in advance, that the title of my talk is sneaky, because though the Chinese government initially denied that the camps existed and then said that they were going away, they still exist, and they're not only not going away, they are being augmented in various ways. So it's very important to recognize that. The reason that we might ask what happened to the camps is that so many other important, in some cases devastating events have taken our attention. For instance, as we speak right now, there is a devastating invasion of Ukraine, and it's important to recognize that inhumane governments, autocrats around the world, continue to do dastardly things. And so I want to set this alongside that and other awful things happening in the present. So let me go back to the question itself. Uyghurs are a Turkic-speaking Muslim population, primarily found in the place that the Chinese call Xinjiang, which means new territories, and Uyghurs call Turkestan, which means East Turkestan. They are also found in hundreds of thousands numbers in Central Asia, and there are large communities in Turkey and the United States and elsewhere. Xinjiang is a very large territory in today's China. It constitutes about 1/6 of the total land mass of the country. It is in the extreme northwest, right next to Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Russia. And we're starting out with very basic questions to help orient people, and we will move on to questions, more refined questions for those who know a bit already.
Great, thank you, Dr. Bovington. Well, again, as part of the context setting, does China have many minorities? And how do they differ from the Han Chinese and from each other?
It's a great question. So China's population today is officially about 1.4 billion people. There are probably a lot of people undercounted since there are still family planning policies and people have births out of plan, so to speak. The Han population, the majority population, is about 92% of the total. The remaining 8%, which is north of 100 million people, consists of 55 officially recognized minority groups, of which Uyghurs are one. There are other Turkic speaking Muslim populations, such as Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and others. There are Chinese speaking Muslims, and then there are Tibetans, Mongolians, many other groups whose names people would know, and there are a lot of groups that many people would not know in various numbers. Some of them are largely indistinguishable in language and physiognomy from the Han population. Others are quite distinct, as are the Uyghurs, for instance.
That's very good, thanks. So is it the case that the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to assimilate these minorities since 1949? Haven't they been punishing the Uyghurs and other Muslims for their religious beliefs and practices all that time?
It would be easy to think so, but I think it would be historically inaccurate. I think actually in 1949, when the communists came to power, they had an ideal of respecting cultural diversity and according a certain amount of political latitude, so-called autonomy, to the various culturally distinct peoples through a system of regional autonomy that they set up. The 1950s was actually a fairly tolerant period, but unfortunately the 60s and 70s were a quite repressive, quite assimilative period. There was a return to a relatively permissive cultural policy in the 1980s for reasons we can get into later. And then, unfortunately, really in the wake of September 11th, the policies toward Uyghurs and others have become much more repressive and much more forcibly assimilative.
Yes, very good. So we heard earlier from Larry on the official response from the Chinese consulate in Chicago regarding the camps. Can you expand a little on this? I mean, how does the Chinese government explain their actions in Xinjiang related to the Muslim minorities?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And the official Chinese story is that the camps are in fact places for educational transformation or reform. And they are, on the one hand, intended to take in people who are religious extremists or have secret terrorist or separatist thoughts, and also who are not suited to today's economy because many of them don't speak Chinese or don't wish to speak Chinese. So the official story is that they're being ideologically reformed, they are being purged of their religious extremism, and they're being transformed into loyal Chinese-speaking citizens, which, as Larry said in the introduction, sounds very much like an official piece of narrative. I've heard Chinese officials say this to me over the years. It's not the least persuasive, but that is the official story of what's going on.
Yes, thank you. So I want to expand a little bit on what you said just earlier and tell us more about what changes in China and the world led to the creation of the camps and the related extraordinary policies of surveillance. I mean, these are the most intense policies of surveillance, I think, in the world.
I absolutely agree, although, as I think we'll get into later, some scholars suggest quite bleakly that the policies that are being attempted there will later spread to other parts of the world. I will say this. I mentioned the permissive policies of the 1980s. They were in part a response to the devastating cultural revolution in China that many people may know of. And they were an attempt by the party to regain the loyalty of Uyghurs, Tibetans, and others who'd been extremely alienated by the harshly repressive and harshly assimilative policies of the 60s and the 70s. In the 1980s and 90s, Uyghurs began to explore their own history. They began to explore literary production again after years of not daring to do so, and many Uyghurs returned to religious practice. Some traveled abroad to make Hajj, to learn abroad. And I will say the results of this were a cultural efflorescence that many Uyghurs today would acknowledge. But in the view of the party, this began a period in which the region became ungovernable, you might say. There were episodes of violence in 1997 that concerned the government. There was a crackdown on mosques and such. There was a major episode in 2009, an uprising protesting labor policies in Southeast China. And the government, in the wake of that, shut off cell phone service and the web for a year, which was pretty amazing. Things settled down, you might say. Again, in 2014, there were a series of violent events, a couple in Beijing, one in Kunming in Southeast China, and several in Xinjiang, that were attributed, I say were attributed, to separatist organizations or Islamist organizations. The Chinese government has never provided persuasive evidence, and in many cases, there's strong evidence of other motivations and so forth. In any case, the official story is that increasing violence, increasing evidence of so-called religious extremism justified these policies. But if you look at the timing of the construction of the camps, which happened years after that violence, and also the number of people taken in, you've mentioned a figure of 10%, this is not really plausible that so many people could be terrorists or religious extremists, which makes us want to question the very premises of these camps.
Yes, absolutely. So, Dr. Bovingdon, let's talk about the end game here. What do you think that Beijing imagines as the end game of trying to forcibly assimilate Uyghurs. And of course, how are the Uyghurs responding?
So, like Larry, I have been offered an official version of the story. I was told at the Chinese embassy some years ago that the camps provide an opportunity for Uyghurs to learn Chinese and to acquire employment skills. Many of the camps have places where people can learn sewing skills and such, so that they can fit fully into Chinese society. And at the moment I ask, well, if this is about freedom and opportunity, then why not open the gates instead of topping them with barbed wire and locking them and placing high walls around the facilities? In any case, the official version of the end game is the people who enter these camps will learn the error of their ways, discard their extremism, acquire language and job skills, and become happy, productive citizens. Again, I think the method of delivering the lessons, the language lessons and the job skills and so forth, don't really fit the intended outcome. But moreover, we haven't really talked about this yet, but the fact that people are taken into these detention centers without formal charge, they're often not even told later on why they were brought in. The fact that they live under a state of extreme repression and invigilation their entire time in the camps, and that they have no formal sentence, so they have no idea when they get out, leaves them terrorized, demoralized, and terrified. Their family members outside are often not told that they are taken in, have no idea when they will come out. So if the people who are directly taken into the camps are likely to have their spirits broken, the people outside the camps will be terrified of being drawn into the camps themselves. So in my estimation, the likely result is demoralization of the entire society. It is really hard to square that pretty obvious likely result with the happy claims of the Chinese government that this will lead to a better integrated society with more loyal citizens.
Yes, well, that leads to the next question about what, if anything, is being done to persuade Beijing to close the camps. I know there's been some opposition to the idea that the purchase of goods produced by inmates of these camps, but what is being done to persuade Beijing to reverse these policies, and can anything further be done?
This is a really good question, and here we are in a venue for the consideration of international affairs. We must remember that sovereignty is a bedrock principle of relations among states in the world. All members of the United Nations enter with the understanding that they will respect each other's sovereignty. So states are always a little constrained in what they can do. And unfortunately, to reach back to what I mentioned at the beginning, as we watch Vladimir Putin's devastating, unprovoked war on Ukraine, we understand, first of all, that other states realize there's only so much they can do without directly declaring war on Russia to try to get it to stop. And so we're all watching, sadly, the relative insufficiency of economic sanctions and other such policy for getting states to stop. In the case of Russia and Ukraine, the world has understood Ukraine to be an independent state since 1991, as indeed did Moscow in 1991, something that Vladimir Putin bitterly regrets. The world does not challenge Beijing's claim to Xinjiang, again, to the dismay of many Uyghurs. And so, according to the principles of sovereignty, other states more or less acknowledge that Beijing has a right to make policy over the region, unless it egregiously violates human rights. So many of states' attempts in the UN and other organizations to get Beijing to draw back from these policies have focused on the human rights abuses and on charges of forced unfree labor, as in, for instance, the US Congress's December 2021 bill that refuses to allow importation of goods sourced from Xinjiang on the presumption that they may have been made with unfree labor. Now that attacks one economic pillar of the system that we can come back to later. It doesn't really directly, frontally attack Beijing's camps altogether. I mentioned before that Beijing denied years ago in 2018, officially denied in the United Nations that the camps even existed, and then under international pressure admitted that they existed several months later, but insisted that they are a response to terrorism and extremism, that states that criticized China's behavior were not recognizing its right to run its internal affairs, and they were being hypocritical since they too attacked terrorism. So in sum, I would say there have been challenges to China's human rights record by various governments. There have been bills passed to prevent the importation of goods. And then the last thing that happened, you mentioned this earlier on, is a declaration in several venues that what is going on in Xinjiang today is a genocide. That's a delicate matter. It requires some careful interpretation, but unfortunately that too has had very little impact on Beijing's policies.
Yes, thank you. Do you believe that the camps are symptomatic of an increasingly nationalist Chinese Communist Party?
I really do. And in fact, when I was first in Xinjiang in the 1990s, I already observed very strong nationalism. I had been in China in 1989 at the time of the Tiananmen uprising, student protests. Many of my students were protesting in another square elsewhere in China in that year. And the goddess of democracy was an icon of the regard Chinese students had for Western democracy and indeed the United States. In 1999, in the wake of the Belgrade bombings, there were demonstrations in China. They were very anti-United States. There was great hostility. And it was also clear that an increasingly wealthy China that had been growing at such a fantastic clip, over 10% a year since 1979, was increasingly confident in world affairs. And I want to say, and I'm not alone in this, to make up for a, shall we say, a decline in belief in communism, the Chinese Communist Party tried to use nationalism to garner loyalty from its various citizens. And I think along with the claim that the party is fighting terrorism, there is an encouragement to that 92% majority of the population of China to regard the Chinese Communist Party as the protector of Chinese rights, of Chinese pride, and in this case, of China against assaults, external and internal, from disloyal citizens.
That's very good, thank you. So just following up from that, do you see there's a connection between the camps and the stepped up threats to Taiwan, for example, in recent years?
I really do. And I do in part because when I was in Xinjiang in the 1990s, I got into the library of my university, a library, by the way, I was not supposed to get into, but a Uyghur librarian who had regard for me as a scholar allowed me to go in and look at the many, many books that did not appear in the card catalog. And I discovered there was an enormous growth industry among theorists and policy analysts in China in figuring out what had gone wrong in the Soviet Union leading up to 1991 so that China could avoid the consequences, right? And there was indeed a concern that the unrest in Xinjiang, the unrest in Tibet, and increasing unwillingness of the Taiwanese to consider so-called reunification with China were all linked in a kind of a domino theory. If one goes, the others go. And we can turn it around and suggest that Beijing's draconian policies toward Xinjiang and Tibet are intended to send a message. Don't you dare flout our authority. And you didn't mention it, but Hong Kong is also part of this equation. The increasing repression and party pressure in Hong Kong is also intended to indicate that the party will take things in hand. The problem, of course, is that Taiwan is a free society. It's a vibrant democracy with access to global news and information. And I think this repressiveness, this heavy hand, has had an effect quite opposite what Beijing intended. And so now we are seeing Beijing, I want to suggest, in its quiet about what Putin is doing in Ukraine, Beijing is essentially allowing its silence to suggest, well, if Putin can do this in Ukraine, perhaps we can and might do the same thing in Taiwan in the future.
Yes, so now we're coming to the last of the questions in our context setting session. Before we go into the general Q&A, and I've already got quite a few questions lined up here. Dr. Bovingdon, can we connect this oppression of Uyghur with Xi Jinping's joint communique with Putin at the Beijing Olympics and with Beijing's responses to Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
I think it's unambiguous. When Putin showed up at the Beijing Olympics and he and Xi issued a joint communique. It was a very obvious example of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. China supported Putin's claims to Chechnya and other territories, and supported Putin's threats that Ukraine ought not to stray too far. And Putin reciprocally supported China's claim to a single China that included Taiwan. So it was very clear that both of them saw geopolitical benefits from appearing together and seeming to support each other's territorial claims.
Yes, I'm sure that's going to lead to a lot of questions. So now for the second part of the program, we want to hear from you with your questions. Now to ask a question, please click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type in your question for our speaker. As I mentioned, we've also received a couple of questions from guests in advance of the program. And I'll go straight to that first question. So Dr. Bovingdon, of course, as a prelude to asking you this question, and I wanted to let everyone know that that you're a fluent speaker of the Uyghur language, and you've actually lived for some years in Xinjiang, in Urumqi, as part of your studies. And of course, you have many strong personal connections with the Uyghur that you've developed over the years. And so this first question is one that I'm sure is very close to your heart. About 5 years ago, Dr. Rahil Dawood, a professor of Uyghur folklore and pilgrimage in Xinjiang, and who had also spent some time in Andrew Wilmington, went missing on a trip to a conference in Beijing. No one heard of her for years, none of her children, family, no one. And some suspected that she was either in one of the Uyghur camps or had been executed. Just recently, middle of last year, we learned that she is in a Chinese prison, which is quite separate from these camps. What do you know about this case, and what is its significance?
I'm glad that you offered me the opportunity to talk about a good friend of mine. Rahila Dawood was one of my closest friends when I lived in Xinjiang. She was a professor there when I was a student in the middle 90s. She was an extraordinary person, brilliant scholar, internationally recognized. She appeared at multiple international conferences where I saw her, and she was authorized multiple times to make research trips abroad, including a period as a visiting scholar here in Bloomington, working with me and Dr. Gunisa Nazarova, who's here today. And she is a specialist on folklore, on pilgrimages, on Uyghur Sufi Islam, a distinct practice community of Muslims. And her scholarship is highly regarded by people around the world. When Beijing first opened the camps and claimed that it was taking in religious extremists and other unsavory elements, I was skeptical, but I decided to withhold judgment. But when I learned that Rahila, among other scholars that I knew, because a number of prominent Uyghur scholars and intellectuals have been taken in as well, when I learned that she'd been detained, and by the way, I learned not because it was officially announced, but because her family members decided finally that it made more sense to speak than to keep it a secret, I realized there is no rhyme or reason to this. This is a systematic root and branch attack on Uyghur society and culture. So for years, her family asked government officials for information without success. And then last year, as you said, the government tersely announced that she had been sentenced to prison. And as you said, prisons are distinct from the camps, but sadly, one other answer to my initial question, what's happening to the camps, is that some people that Beijing regards as too great a threat to allow them ever to return to society, you might say they are so sick they can't be reformed, are now being put through really kangaroo courts that try them extremely quickly without standards of evidence and then give them draconian sentences of 7, 10, 15 years. And we think that she has had such a sentence. The charges have never been publicized. So if you think about Beijing's image of a productive, happy Uyghur who's a good emblem for Uyghur accomplishment, Rahila Dawood would have been a great one, and she was for many years. And so the fact that she was initially disappeared and then sentenced makes me extremely pessimistic that Beijing has any good path out of these awful policies and the system of camps.
Yes, I mean, it's extraordinary. The group Scholars at Risk has had an ongoing campaign first to try and find her. And it may well be that she's been in one of these camps. And one of the questions that's in the chat is, how long do people typically stay in these camps? But of course, 3, 4, 5 years, it's unknown. I mean, there is no limit on this, but I'll get you to reply to that too. But just coming back to Professor Dalwich, because you might want to share a little bit of about what she actually writes about and how that might be interpreted as anything controversial.
Right. So, and by the way, you and I spoke about our mutual interest in pilgrimages. Plenty of people who are religious and plenty of people who aren't realize that the pilgrimage movement from significant site to significant site, for those who pray, an opportunity to pray, to venerate saints and so forth, is a crucial part of embodying one's religious belief, one's connection to something beyond what one sees and so forth. So she herself, though not deeply religious, was a great scholar of pilgrimage, and she wrote beautiful and extremely well-sourced scholarship about the various pilgrimage sites, about the people who frequented them, about their religious practices and so forth. I mentioned Sufi Islam before. Sufism is a mystical practice of Islam. You might liken it, for instance, in the world of Buddhism to Zen Buddhism, with an emphasis on inner contemplation, where some Muslims in the world eschew music. Sufis actually revere music and like to dance and so forth. And she actually shared with me many years ago some brilliant video she took of Sufi communities dancing, praying together, and experiencing the spirit together, as you might say. Why did this matter? This mattered in part because the official version of Islam allowed by the state. So the Chinese state is officially, the Chinese Communist Party is officially atheist, declares religion the opium of the masses, but the constitution protects freedom of religious belief, not practice, by the way. So the officially sanctioned version of Islam is, you might say, very orthodox, and does not allow for private gatherings, for ecstatic multi-day meetings and so forth. Her research revealed what ordinary Uyghurs did, how they prayed, the existence of popular Islam, by the way, completely without a politics, without any intention of upsetting the apple cart, if you will. But because it was not officially sanctioned and because it connected people across vast spaces within the region, the government was not particularly happy about it, though, as I said before, it allowed her to do her research, to publish in multiple languages, including Chinese, for years before deciding finally that this was unacceptable. So she's important not only because she revealed the existence of a vibrant popular Islam that, as I say, had no political aspirations, but also because she was preserving and enhancing Uyghurs' knowledge of their own culture.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to join two questions from Ray here. So the knowledge of what's going on in the camps often comes from people who have been released and then escaped into neighboring countries to report on what's happened in there. So Ray's two questions. How long do people typically stay in camps? Have people who have been released been reformed? And can Uyghurs easily escape from China?
So I'll handle them in reverse order. So Uyghurs cannot easily escape from China. So for some years now, the government has been refusing to issue passports to all but a tiny handful of selected Uyghurs judged to be politically reliable. You can make your own interpretation of that. And for those who possess passports, the government has taken the extraordinary measure of demanding that they give them up to the local police station for the care of the government. So the second question was, is it easy to tell whether people have been reformed? You might predict, and you would be right, that the government has paraded on television, on radio, and in print numbers of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and others who've been through the camps and say, I see the error of my ways, I'm so glad that the party saved me, and so forth. In my own work, in my 2010 book, I talked about what I call political ventriloquism, when some people are persuaded or compelled to speak on behalf of the government, this is the result. It sounds hollow. Nobody is persuaded by that kind of language. A lot of the stories we know come from people who, as Ray says, escaped to Central Asia or elsewhere. Many of those because they're actually citizens of other countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so forth. And from those people, we hear that they themselves were not persuaded. They describe what they saw as unmitigated and inexcusable human rights abuse. So there was nothing constructive or healing about what they saw inside. And by the way, there are excellent records on people who've escaped the camps and told their stories, kept by Jean Bunin, B-U-N-I-N, a great scholar and activist in Central Asia. Also, the Xinjiang Documentation Project, maintained by Gudana Selimjan in Vancouver, is an excellent resource. If people are interested in chapter and verse, if people want to read moving stories, there's a great article by Refi Kachadurian in the New Yorker months back that describes the story of one person who was involved in them. So it would be very nice for us, and it would be very nice for those people who've recently been detained to know the answer to the first question, which was, how long are people typically kept inside? Since people are not told what the charge is against them, they're often told you should know what you did wrong. They are regularly ordered on pain of punishment to examine themselves, criticize themselves, and come up with confessions of their crimes, which of course might actually risk getting them further punishment. They never know. Right? There is no typical stay. And unfortunately, in most cases, those people who have been released are released because they are ill, and I think the government is concerned that not too many people die inside the camps, or because they have relatives outside pleading for their release, right? So there is no typical length of stay, and people are never told how long they'll be in or what they need to do finally to get out.
Yes, absolutely. Well, just in terms of that, as I mentioned, groups like Scholars at Risk are focusing on particular individuals that they know, academics in particular, who are in the camps or in prisons. But what are the other organizations around the world, not just here in the US, but around the world, that are really trying to make an effort here?
Ones that we all know: Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Human Rights in China. All these are excellent. The European Union has done a great job. There's a European Human Rights Organization that has done an investigation. Let me especially foreground, for many of you, the work of the Uyghur Human Rights Project and the Uyghur American Association in the United States that has been doing extraordinary work to reveal what's going on inside, and Radio Free Asia, which is a news organization based in Washington, DC, revealing this. But also recently, there was a Uyghur tribunal set up and conducted in the UK with a number of prominent international law scholars and a parade of people who had been detained in the camps describing their experiences. This tribunal, which it's important to say did not have international recognition, but was conducted very scrupulously, unambiguously came to the conclusion that these camps were abrogating human rights and that they should be shut down immediately.
Yes, yes. So now one of our viewers asks, given that it's not just Uyghurs in those camps, there's also Kazakhs, there's also Uzbeks and other minorities in the camps, and the question is, what is the response of these neighboring countries, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and so on, to the oppression of their people inside, in Xinjiang, and they specifically mention the Belt and Road Project and how that might be influencing the response by these neighboring countries to the situation.
Right. So I would imagine many people watching are Americans, and Americans can go abroad in confidence that were they to be detained without charge, or even if they were charged abroad, the United States government would send a representative to ask what was going on, to insist that trials be proper and so forth. Sadly, citizens of Central Asian states have not had the same kind of protections from their governments. And The short-term answer is yes, absolutely. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is Beijing's attempt to, as it says, build a new Silk Road through Central Asia and across the seas as well, has brought lucre to the governments of Central Asia in the form of loans, investments in infrastructure, highways, pipelines, and such. And therefore, these governments might perceive that their material interests lie athwart any attempt to take an interest in the human rights of their citizens. Sadly, this has been going on long before the Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, Beijing very adroitly managed its relations with those Central Asian states when they were left high and dry after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Many of them were in fiscal crisis. And if not for some timely aid and loans from Beijing, they would have been in really bad straits. And so many of them have, I will say, sadly, towed the line with Beijing since that time, and they began oppressing their Uyghur citizens and Kazakh emigres and others already in the 1990s. So sadly, the answer is these governments have done very little.
Yes, yes. All right, changing the direction a little bit here with this this next question. How would you equate the treatment of the Uyghur population with the treatment of the Falun Gong inside and outside of China? And why, other than their strident anti-Chinese Communist Party mandate, have Falun Gong and their communications vehicles like the Epoch Times newspaper and the Shenyun performance group waded into far-right, right-wing US politics, promoting conspiracy theories from QAnon, as well as anti-vax, anti-evolution, the big steel, and so on. Does the Chinese government consider Falun Gong and the Uyghurs to be similar threats to the Chinese Communist Party's hold on power in China?
So it's a great question, and there's a lot to chew on there. So let's back up and just ask, what is Falun Gong? Falun Gong is a religious organization that draws on a very old Chinese tradition called Qigong. These are practices of disciplining the breath, of meditation, in some cases of exercises that have been part of Chinese culture for centuries. And that were officially supported by the Chinese Communist Party back in the 80s when I mentioned the relatively permissive policies. There were lots of Qigong practitioners. I was taught by one in China in 1988. Falun Gong is a particular branch with a very charismatic leader, Li Hongzhi, who wrote a book of theology about the great wheel of discipline. Let us say this: he connected these historical practices of breath and meditation and so forth with some rather speculative visions of the universe. And as it became clear that he was gaining more and more adherents, the party began to take an interest in and then get concerned about this organization. And in 1999, when members of Falun Gong staged a demonstration demanding their right to practice freely, the government got very alarmed, declared Falun Gong an evil cult, and began to imprison Falun Gong practitioners, right? There is no question that the party state treated them in a beastly fashion, in some cases, really abusing them and torturing them. It forbid the practice, it forbid information about Falun Gong. As a consequence, and in response, Falun Gong International began to build a network of practitioners to try to promote Falun Gong abroad, to cast doubt on Beijing, and ultimately realized there was money to be made and influence to be had from setting up a news organization. Some of you may have heard of Epoch Times and Phoenix Television. And then Shenyun is a dance, it's a dance performance that has been scheduled around the world. I've seen it in every country I've ever visited. I've seen it advertised, I should say, that makes a lot of money for this organization. At this point, I need to be honest and say that a lot of the news and a lot of the propaganda spouted by Falun Gong is fairly loopy. And I'm afraid it was mentioned that there's associations with far-right organizations here and with disinformation. I'm afraid that some Falun Gong practitioners and activists have followed very simply the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So anyone who agrees to criticize Beijing is immediately part of the gang. Now, are there connections between Falun Gong and the Uyghurs? It has been suggested that the principle and the practices of educational transformation, 教育转化 in Chinese, were originally developed for managing and trying to cure Falun Gong practitioners, and then were brought to the horrible detention camps we're talking about now. The government has not officially said that Uyghurs belong to an evil cult. That would make real problems for Beijing's relations with Muslim states, especially countries like Saudi Arabia, with whom it has very, very advantageous mutual relations. So while recognizing Islam, while recognizing the rights of Muslims to their faith, Beijing has claimed that it's cracking down on extremism rather than just Islam full stop. And sad to say, Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, has officially backed up China's policies, saying we too are enemies of extremism. So there are connections, and then there are some sharp distinctions.
Yes, yes, very good. Ray Montano brings up the question of leverage. China appears to have no fear on this issue. What leverage does any organization or country, I think of the world organizations, have in this case to help the Uyghur?
Sad to say, very little, right? That's the simple answer. And again, I would refer us all to the attempts by the Biden administration and various European governments to find some purchase with Vladimir Putin, shutting down Nord Stream, ending Russia's most favored nation status, shutting down the banks, possibly precipitating a crisis of payments and a catastrophic fall in the ruble. All of this will hurt Putin and his oligarchs and the citizens very badly, but it's not clearly causing Putin to refrain from an obvious unjustified war. So given that sad recent example, it's hard to imagine that any government abroad might find purchase with Beijing, especially given that Beijing has a production platform that produces many of the goods for multinational corporations based abroad in Europe and the United States. So there is precious little leverage to be found at this point. I will just say I'm a strong believer in the principles of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and I think probably the best hope is to get Communist Party leaders to see that they are not following their own ethical commitments. It's very hard to see how to do that at this point.
Yes, yes. So, well, in this next question, we're actually going to bring it home to Indiana here, and I think you'll like this question, and I can certainly add some light on it as well, given my previous role with the Confucius Institute in Indianapolis. Here it is. In the current issue of the New Yorker, the question was asked: have Chinese spies infiltrated American campuses? Are Chinese students in American universities monitored for their activism in such areas of concern, such as the treatment of the Uyghur, or are they presented with the official position of the Chinese government on such issues and expected to hold to this line in any discussions on the subject? Are they or their families subjected to punishment or surveillance upon their return if they fail to comply?
These are great and important questions. And let me say this first, and this is not a public service announcement. I have been lucky, Indiana University has been lucky to have a very large number of students from China. I have been really impressed with some of the students from China in their ability to think critically, to reflect on what they've been taught. It's very clear that many of them come to the United States, or go to Europe for that matter, for the advantages of a liberal education, the freer atmosphere, and so forth. There's no denying this, and I have benefited immensely from having those students, as has the university, as does every university in the United States. At the same time, there is no question that Beijing is sending students with pay to surveil various universities. Some so-called students might indeed be spies. There is no question about this. Furthermore, many students understand that even if they do not wish to, they have no choice but to report back to some governing body what they see and hear in order to protect themselves against falling afoul of the government when they return or having their family members punished, because Beijing has long made use of a tactic of autocracies around the world, which is you may be abroad, but your family isn't. We can get to you. So the influence of this spy network is palpable. I have had some of the Chinese students that I'm so grateful to teach come and complain to me that they know other students are watching. Some students have come to me in my office hours and say they don't dare to study in my classes or other classes on campus for fear of getting in trouble with the government. I will also say that I have seen people come to my classes or public lectures and glare and leave in the middle or ask questions that bear the unmistakable hallmarks of the propaganda machine, clearly there as representatives of the Chinese government. So the influence is there. It is palpable.
Yes, absolutely. So Betty, you had a question. You want to unmute?
Yes, going further with the students, I'm in Lafayette, and Purdue University, as you know, also 20% of its population are international students, and the majority of those are either from India or China. And I don't think this made the Indianapolis Star, so you may not have seen it, but it was in the local newspaper, that the same thing where a student, one of the students from China, was being outspoken about her own thoughts on some matter of Chinese policy, which she shouldn't have said. You're here in the land of the free, but don't speak that way. And this got back to China, and she was being reprimanded. And there's a fear also that not only are you reprimanded, but of course your families that are back in China. So the risk is fluid. And Mitch Daniels spoke out. And presidents of other universities are challenged by this because they are aware that if they speak out, they may further that risk. But Mitch Daniels is an independent guy, and he felt this is wrong. And he spoke out for the student, that a student has a right to freedom while they're here. And I was I've tried to follow up on this to see what might have happened since. I don't know what happened to the student or her family, if she's still here, what have you. I don't know what other university presidents, if they called him and said, Mitch, what are you doing? Did you hear about this, number one? And number two, what were your thoughts about what he did? He's done a remarkable job, frankly, as president of the university. He's kept the tuition, as you know, frozen, but he is an outspoken person. And I think he felt he should speak out on this on behalf of the student. Was that, in your opinion, was that wise? Was it not? And what might happen further?
So I apologize for not knowing of this story. I am very grateful for your telling me and all of us. I would say when a university president speaks out on behalf of scholarly freedom and the freedom of speech is a very important thing. I have not yet mentioned, though some of you know already, that I have not been able to go to China since the early 2000s. I'm officially banned from China. And so I depend for much of my information on what I learned from my students and other excellent scholars, right? I'm a big fan of an open academy. And so I think it's very important for those students from China and India and elsewhere to come to Indiana and other places. I think we really benefit from it. By the same token, if those students are allowed to come, they should also be allowed to enjoy all the benefits of studying in this place. So if the Chinese government or any other government attempts to silence them, surveil them, or cow them into not speaking out, that is unacceptable to me, and it is an abrogation of basic principles of scholarly sharing. So I'm glad that he spoke out, and I wish more academic leaders would do that.
What's going to happen to her family? I think the other part of that, though, is yes, but her family may bear consequences, and that's the threat.
I agree with you, right? So obviously I don't have an answer to what's going to happen to her family. She has to know, every student coming from a country run by an autocracy that doesn't respect human rights has to know that it's possible for the government to punish family members or friends at home as a way of trying to affect their behaviors. So this is a risk that every such student undertakes in going abroad. I really do worry about that.
Yeah.
That's all I'll say for now, but I'm glad that you flagged this issue for all of us to consider. In fact, I will say this. I teach some classes on very sensitive topics. I teach a course on Xinjiang where we talk about the camps at length. And I tell the students at the beginning, we're going to talk about everything. And if I have students who've identified themselves as PRC citizens, I tell them, look, I want you to think carefully about what it means for you to step in my classroom. You are absolutely welcome, right? But I'm sure you know, and if you don't know, I'm telling you that you're being watched here. So you need to think about the consequences for yourself. And I have students express real gratitude that I'm aware of this and that they know that I keep this in mind in the class. But you're right. By the way, let me just recommend a brilliant article from many years ago by Perry Link, a great China scholar, himself banned way back when. He wrote a great piece called The Anaconda in the Chandelier in the New York Review of Books. It's a great metaphor. And the point of this article is encapsulated in the metaphor. If you are in a room with a chandelier and there's a big snake in it, you know the snake might strike you, but you don't know when or why. You're liable to shrink your body to the smallest silhouette possible and avoid doing anything that might provoke the snake. So his point is, autocratic regimes do well not to explain what their red lines are, what's going to provoke them into action, because in that case, people police themselves, and they are even more careful than they would be if they knew where the boundaries were. Thank you for your question.
Right, so I'm going to join two questions here, or comments. One of our viewers asks or warns us about seeing the issue or looking at the issue through what he describes as a US bubble. And the related question from someone else says, can the Chinese Communist Party policies towards the Uyghur, the Tibet, Falun Gong, Hong Kong, etc., be viewed through their eyes as consistent with Eastern attitudes towards the primacy of the state and the good of the greater population versus the emphasis on individual rights and freedoms of the West, and thus a legitimate response to efforts that undermine social cohesion and domestic peace and tranquility?
Yeah, so these are great questions. And they're more advice to us than questions. No, the second one's a question. To the first one, I congratulate this person for pointing something out. We ought not to assume that America or Americans have the perfect and unassailable approach to this problem. Let us remember that this is a country, most of which was once land occupied by Native Americans. So Indiana University has many units that will acknowledge that they operate on land once belonging to Native American peoples of various sorts. So it's important to be clear-eyed about the historical offenses committed by this government. So for those who are unsatisfied by American scholarship and critique, I encourage you to go look at various Europeans. I can recommend dozens of European scholars, or go to Japan or Taiwan or Korea, all of which have scholars who've written on this topic. Those are the places that I'm most aware of. So don't just take the word of a particular American scholar or American critic for it. Now, on the second point, there is a Confucian tradition in East Asia that emphasizes orderly relations, subservience of younger brother to older brother, wife to husband, junior to senior, and so forth. There's no question that this tradition of well-ordered governance that emphasizes hierarchy and obedience characterizes much of East Asia. There's no question about that. At the same time, one might be surprised to learn that Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, all of which have this Confucian heritage, also have successful democracies. Taiwan's is probably the most apposite example here, because it's a country of 23 million people, which has had a vibrant democracy after, by the way, years of single-party authoritarian rule. If Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan with Confucian heritage, with a past of centralized authoritarian states, can develop functioning democracies in which people recognize and value human rights, there's no bar to the same happening in China. And therefore, there's no justification for saying this is the natural order in East Asia.
Yes, very good. Now, Larry has posted the link to the media comments by Mitch Daniels, the Purdue letter. Larry, did you want to say a bit more on that?
No, I just, it was said to me by Kathy Kozinski, who wanted the group to see it. So it's just in reference to the comments that that Betty Tonsing made about Mitch Daniels' comment. I thought the group might choose to want to see what Mitch Daniels had to say. Thanks.
Good.
I think it's important to say too, and Dr. Bovington, you would probably, the concern, and I forgot this part, the concern was not only the parents back home, but other, as you were mentioning, other students on campus were harassing her. The patriots were harassing her, so. You know.
Yes, and Dr. Tonsing, thank you for your question. Thank you for your comments. And let me just say that some of you may be aware of a loose organization that has a funny name in Chinese. It's called the 50 Cent Party, the Wumaodang. And this is a description of young people who are media savvy, who linger on social media, and essentially shill for the Chinese Communist Party on a regular basis. And many of these students on American campuses are essentially, and they are recognized and described as members of the 50 Cent Party, essentially selling the Chinese Communist Party's story in places where skeptics and, shall we say, critical news make that story less audible and less plausible. But yes, I'm absolutely agreeing with you that one can see students shouting each other down, harassing each other on campuses, and it's a very sad thing.
Yes, well, just on that note, Ray Montagno had put a note in the chat box. Ray, can you share something about what you've read on that from Cornell?
Yeah, there was a female Uyghur student who was posing a question to a U.S. representative, asking him why the U.S. has been slow to respond to the Uyghurs and now so quickly responding to the Ukraine crisis. And when she did that, a group of Chinese students in the classroom stood up and booed her and stormed out of the room.
Yeah, it's appalling. And since I was lucky enough to study at Cornell, I'm very sad for my former institution. I hope that the administration responded. Let me say that a few minutes ago, I referred to scholars in various places in the world, and I include in that list of scholars Uyghur and Kazakh scholars found in these various countries who've been lucky enough to come to places where they can study and write and speak freely. I will also say that I've participated in many a public event where some students or some participants have attempted to shout others down. And I was part of an event hosted by Brandeis several years ago, at which a very articulate young law scholar, Uyghur woman in the United States, was giving a very, very compelling and heartfelt presentation involving her brother's incarceration in this camp system, and some others, I'm quite certain they were Chinese students, vandalized her Zoom page, putting all kinds of rude comments on the page in order to devalue what she was saying, which was appalling on so many levels. But this is, again, why I think it's so important to allow free inquiry, allow people to have their say as long as they listen to other people when it's their turn. But I do not accept this kind of abuse of other people for speaking out, speaking their minds.
Yeah, so Ray, I want to come back to you and an earlier comment that you'd made. Ray, you mentioned about the treatment of the Uyghur must have a chilling effect on other groups in China who might even have more moderate goals regarding personal freedom. So Ray, Ray, did you want to expand on that?
Well, sure. I was thinking that, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit too, a little already, is that as if I'm somebody who's maybe traveled around the world and seen personal freedoms in other countries, that I might have a mild interest in it. Not necessarily I want to overthrow the government or anything, just kind of have less surveillance and so forth. But witnessing what happens with the Uyghurs, does that have a kind of a chilling effect on other people in kind of expressing their opinions?
I think it definitely does. And we didn't really go into the matter of how the party decides, how party officials decide whom to throw into the camps, and leaks of documents to the New York Times and to The Intercept, and documents collected, by the way, on the Xinjiang Documentation Project site that I mentioned earlier, reveal that one of the categories of people who ought to be taken into the camps in the view of the government is people who have traveled abroad or who have family abroad, right? So in addition to the egregious case of my dear friend, the brilliant scholar Raila Dawood, I infer from this that the party is afraid of people who have expanded their worldview, who have looked outside the story of events and the system of government offered by Beijing. And so that's point number one. Point number two, for a long time, people were saying that Uyghurs had the misfortune to be Muslim in a post 9/11 world, and also to have political aspirations to independence, some of them, right? But the Chinese-speaking Muslims, the so-called Hui or Donggan, were treated much better. And that was true, still is true today. There are very few Hui in these camps. However, there is now a major initiative by Beijing to de-Arabize the practice, the architecture of Hui mosques and Muslims. So Arabic script has been struck off mosques. Elements of mosque architecture thought to be too Arab looking have been struck from these Hui mosques throughout the country. So now Muslims, of whom there are well over 20 million in China as a total, all understand that they are on notice. I will add that I personally know a number of Chinese citizens who are Christians and who do not belong to the officially recognized church. And they see a threat to themselves here. For years, Beijing has been concerned about so-called house churches. So lots of other groups worry and legitimately worry about this. Let me go back to the beginning, by the way, and take this opportunity to tout the work of a brilliant young scholar, an anthropologist named Darren Byler, and this book, which is inexpensive and highly readable and devastating. And one of the points that he makes here is that technologies for facial recognition, for surveilling phones, which have to be installed, by the way, on every cell phone of every Uyghur in Xinjiang and so forth, were developed in places like Seattle, Washington, my hometown, through multinational corporations. This facial recognition software, which was really rolled out in Xinjiang, is now operating throughout China and increasingly in other centers in the world, right? So the bleak vision that we are talking about here, in some senses, has its genesis not only in the political aims of the Chinese government, but in, shall we say, the availability of this technology from major software and hardware manufacturers for all kinds of uses, including some that are really concerning.
Wow, that's extraordinary. We have time for a couple more questions, so get them in there. So there's one which is an interesting one, and I hadn't thought about this. Dr. Bovington, is there such a thing as Uyghur Tibetan solidarity in opposition to the Chinese oppression?
So inside the country of China, no. And by that, I don't mean that Uyghurs and Tibetans are not aware of each other and each other's plights. What I mean is that the Chinese Communist Party does not allow any kind of cross-group solidarity, let alone any kind of organization and so forth. Abroad, there certainly has been. Historically, there was an organization that joined Mongols, Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Taiwanese out of a feeling that they all shared a common cause. That organization is not as vibrant as it once was, but certainly abroad, Tibetans and Uyghurs are aware that these groups have been subject to horrific human rights abuses. And so there is some communication and mutual support. Just let me add, one of the people attending asked me to say the name of this book. It is called In the Camps, China's High-Tech Penal Colony, and the scholar's name is Byler, B-Y-L-E-R. This is an excellent book. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And he has another also excellent scholarly book published this year with the chilling name of Terror Capitalism, suggesting that it's a version of capitalism designed to address terror, but also to provoke terror. So strong plug for his book.
Sure. We have a question from Kathy Kozensky. Kathy, would you like to ask your question? Kathy?
Sorry, I was looking up the book and got, you know how you get with your icon. I wondered to thank you for all of your time and energy. We appreciate everything you're doing. Are the Kazakhs and other citizens from other countries that surround China, are they worried? Because I can see them trying to slowly chop away bits and pieces and claim it for their own, similar to what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. So I didn't know if you have a sense of if they're worried about that or not.
It's a good question. So I guess, let me just make sure that I understand your question. Are the governments and the citizens of Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, which abut China, worried that China might take some of their territory in the way that Putin has claimed Ukraine? So it is an interesting question. And I would say, I mentioned before that Beijing very adroitly managed its relations with the newly independent countries of Central Asia in the 1990s. One of the first things it did was schedule bilateral talks with these newly independent governments. And in several cases, it induced these governments not to insist on claiming back territories that had been historically part of Tsarist Russia and then had been ceded by the Soviet Union to China years ago. So in each case, Beijing negotiated some kind of compromise on territory in which both sides promised not to have soldiers stationed on either side and also not to make further land claims. In a couple of those cases, the governments made these agreements secretly, and one I'm aware of in Kyrgyzstan. When Kyrgyz citizens found out that the government in Bishkek had made this agreement, there were protests in the streets. Okay, but my final answer here is that Beijing is not likely to claim lands in these Central Asian territories anytime soon, but do watch the so-called South China Sea, where China is attempting to claim sea and islands from multiple neighboring countries, including Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia.
Yes, yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, on that question, they don't have to actually physically take countries. You just look at the pattern of Chinese investment in Africa, and this is colonization by another term. Some would argue. Is that your opinion as well, Dr. Bovingdon?
That there is a kind of, let us call it, neo-colonial investment by the People's Republic in various countries in Africa, in Latin America, that looks very much like the neo-colonial policies, let us say, of the United States years ago, and before that, Britain and France, and so on. The idea being, this is a way of securing supplies of grain, of various raw materials for China's still growing economy, ensuring itself against future shortages and so forth. So yes, China is attempting to extend its influence through loans, through investments abroad and so forth, to develop a kind of network of influence of the type, again, that the United States government has enjoyed for decades prior.
Right, so we're just about out of time. Last call on questions. Any last ones? If not, then I'd like to thank you, Dr. Bovingdon, for joining us this evening. And I want to turn the program back over to Larry to close us out.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Bovington as well. This has been really a wonderful evening in terms of learning things that we didn't really know about and that we hadn't heard about. So I really thank you for sharing your time and your insights with us this evening. And thank you, Dr. McIntosh, for your moderation, or that is for moderating the program. It was a wonderful job you did. Perhaps this being St. Patrick's Day, we should say moderation should be the word of the day. So, so thank you again. Now, please mark your calendar for our next distinguished speaker program on Thursday, April 21st, when we'll present a provocative program on conspiracy theories, their history, their ubiquity, their causes and consequences. Evidence indicates that the vast majority of people have fallen prey to one or more conspiracy theory. So be prepared for an interesting, if not controversial, discussion about how such theories are spread and amplified in our interconnected world through social media and the consequences that we're seeing in real time. ICWA tries to help people make sense of global events, especially in the face of conflicting information. So critical thinking requires us to listen to the statements on both sides and to compare them against verifiable evidence to make an informed decision. So I hope the information presented this evening helps give you some evidence to sort through the conflicting statements made and help you make an informed decision of your own. And that, in fact, is what the Great Decisions program is all about. So our Great Decisions series continues next Tuesday on March 22nd with a program on changing demographics, which features Dr. Kira Ellendorf. So be sure to register and join us then. Now, you can find more information about all of our programs on our Indiana Council on World Affairs website at indianaworld.org, where you will also find a recording of this and previous programs. This program should be up tomorrow sometime. Let us know if you'd like to join us as a volunteer to help us plan and deliver programs such as this to help people make sense of the world around us. So for now, on behalf of the Indiana Council on World Affairs, we once more thank our distinguished speaker, Dr. Gardner Bovington, and all of you who joined us this evening. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Good luck to all of your favorite teams in the March Madness college basketball tournaments. Good evening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.